Saving Face by Kiribaku Happiness. It started, as most things seem to for Bakugou Katsuki, with a fight. "Your mum was here today," Kirishima mumbled, from the other side of the table where they'd set up to do their homework together 15 minutes ago. Katsuki tensed. The pen he was using to hastily write down the solution for some quadratic equation stilled without his permission. It was a knee-jerk reaction, if anything else. The thought of his mother invading his school space, walking through the halls of Heights Alliance, fucking snooping around in his room, it was enough to set his teeth on edge. There was a reason he'd spent the whole of his afternoon at the gym. He forced himself to take a breath and unclench, before he gritted out, "She dropped some shit off." Kirishima nodded, gnawing on his pencil with his razor-sharp teeth. Katsuki wasn't stupid. Kirishima's attention span for their homework had always left more to be desired, but he usually tried to give some effort, at least for the first half an hour. It hadn't gone unnoticed by him that the redhead had barely even managed to get through the first problem. He was obviously distracted, thinking about something, teetering on the edge of bringing it up, or letting it lay to rest. Katsuki wasn't stupid, but that didn't mean he knew how to handle these kinds of situations. Ones where something other than his blazing fists and feral smiles were needed of him, expected of him. His pen started moving again, and he finished the rest of problem 4 before moving on to problem 5. "I saw her talking with Tokiyami, asking about you and stuff." Kirishima thought he was so slick. Like Katsuki couldn't hear the accusatory tone in his voice that he was so desperately trying to stifle. His pen stopped again. He forced himself to look up. Kirishima's hair was down today, like it was every weekend, held back from his forehead with a white bandana that Katsuki had grown accustomed to seeing on him. Had grown to appreciate seeing on him. It gave his soft face and boyish scar a little something. Katsuki didn't know what that something was, but it tugged at his navel and demanded his attention most weekends, so he'd long since determined that it must be something good. Kirishima bit at his lip and watched him with eyes that brimmed with 1,000 different emotions. Katsuki didn't know how one look could throw him off in so many different directions. Whenever he looked at his own face in the mirror, or at his passing reflection in the expanse of some glass windows, he usually saw anger or boredom or annoyance, or some variation of those three things. Kirishima looked at him with warmth and apprehension and determination and hesitance all at once, and Katsuki didn't know what he was supposed to be saying right now. He poked his tongue into his cheek. "Okay?" Kirishima blinked at him, taken aback onto that growing list of emotions, displayed clearly across his face like a canvas. "Okay," he breathed out. There was a new emotion now, one Katsuki was all too familiar with, though he'd never seen it from the incarnate of sunshine itself sitting across from him. A flash of anger. He looked back down to his homework and tried to read the problem in front of him. "She didn't say anything about me." Katsuki snorted on reflex. Judging by the way the tension in the air thickened and settled into his lungs, though, he knew that had not been the right way to respond to that statement. Fuck. "Consider yourself lucky," Katsuki forced out, continuing an act of nonchalance that he did not feel. "Should I?" The anger was evident now. Kirishima wasn't even trying to hide it. Katsuki looked back at him and glared, scrutinizing his face. Kirishima's jaw was clenched, and the grip on his pencil made his knuckles white. His shoulders were ramrod stiff, and his eyes of 1,000 emotions burned Katsuki with a steadfast glare. Kirishima Ejiro had never been afraid of him. "You got something to say to me?" Katsuki snarled. Anger pushing past the newer emotions of doubt and uncertainty he'd begun to feel coiling around the inside of his chest. Anger was easier to manage, so he focused on that. Kirishima's throat bobbed as he swallowed, but he wouldn't back down. He never had before. It was why Katsuki respected him so much, admired the idiot even. It just seems weird that you would talk to Tokuyami about you. And not me, was what was so clearly dangling at the end of that sentence. Katsuki pursed his lips together. This felt like a fight. No, he wasn't stupid. This was a fight. The start of one, anyway. It was strange for it to be happening with Kirishima, but it was definitely a fight, and Katsuki felt his defenses spearing out through his skin and hardening around him. I'm allowed to have friends. Now it was Kirishima's turn to snort, though it was filled with all different kinds of emotions that Katsuki was not used to hearing from him. Derision, bewilderment, frustration, disbelief. It made the fire that forever seemed to simmer in the pit of his stomach spark and ignite. Yeah, I know. He waved his hands, gripping his pencil vaguely around it himself. Exhibit A. Is that what this was about? Katsuki clenched his jaw. I'm allowed to have friends that aren't you. Kirishima's shoulders set. Katsuki was surprised that pencil was still going strong. Do your parents know you're gay? Katsuki tensed even more, if it were possible. His nostrils flared as a fresh wave of anger coursed through him. He had been careful to avoid this conversation over the past 6 months. Careful to dismiss it, to pretend that it wasn't there, and hopefully forget about it. Of course, Kirishima wouldn't let him. Yes, came the clipped answer between his tight lips. He tried to convey through his eyes that Kirishima should stop asking questions, should stop prying, should end this right here and now so they could go back to their homework, go back to their routine. The anger he'd been so accustomed to looked incredibly foreign on Kirishima's face, and it unsettled him in a way that he was not prepared to handle. But Kirishima had never been afraid of him, never knew when to quit. Do they know about me? About us? Finally, a familiar emotion passed over his face, though it did nothing to make Katsuki feel better. Kirishima had never been great at hiding his insecurities, and now here they were, blatantly obvious and directed at him like it was all his fault. Katsuki bristled at the silent accusation. He ground his teeth together as he tried to steady his breathing. If it were anyone else, he would have let loose by now. He would have yelled and threatened them within an inch of their life, and maybe even thrown a few punches if it meant beating this down into submission, casting it aside to be forgotten and ignored, and winning this fight. But this was Kirishima. He didn't want to fight Kirishima. He hadn't even noticed that he'd been flicking his pen around his fingers, until the repetitive sound of it tapping incessantly against the table suddenly broke his thoughts. He forced himself to stop. No, he finally spit out. He didn't trust himself to say more. But they know about Tokuyami Fumikage. Kirishima's eyes clouded quickly. A sadness settled onto him, but it did nothing to hide his anger. Katsuki tossed his pen down to avoid chucking it at the wall. He listened to it clatter along the surface carelessly. You're mad. It wasn't a question, and he wouldn't let it be, because that would be admitting that it was a fight, and that he was actively participating in it, which he wasn't. It was just an observation. Kirishima looked like he was trying not to punch something, eyes averted sideways as he gave a rough shake of his head. I'm not mad, I just don't understand, Katsuki's brain supplied unhelpfully. How come you haven't told anyone, said anything? Katsuki's defenses solidified into place. It's nobody's fucking business. Kirishima hummed quietly, still refusing to lift his eyes from the table. He always knew when Katsuki was lying. So, he started, and Katsuki winced at the realization that the unsteady tremor of that single word was from the effort Kirishima was exerting to try and hold back tears. Nobody at this school can know about us, and the random bus drivers in town can't know about us, and your parents, who already know you're gay, can't know about us either. There was another accusation in there somewhere. Katsuki could hear it. His fingers itched to explode something, his palms covered in a layer of sweat that, coupled with the racing of his heart in his chest, indicated something much too closely to nervousness for his liking. Which was ridiculous. Bakugou Katsuki didn't get nervous. He scratched at the back of his head to alleviate some of the impulsivity he felt growing in the pit of his stomach. "You're mad," he said again, harder this time. "I'm not mad." Kirishima's voice sounded strained and tight. Katsuki slammed his fist down onto the table as hard as he could. The sting that jolted up his arm felt good, and it recoiled some of the anger simmering hot under his skin, long enough for him to grind out an aggressive, "Bullshit!" Kirishima hesitated, his mouth opening despite the delay it took for the words to come out. The air in the room was coated in tension, and Katsuki felt like he was suffocating on it. He wished they were doing this somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't Kirishima's room. Somewhere that hadn't become Katsuki's sanctuary. Kirishima's room was not meant to be filled with such resentment and hostility. It made his stomach twist aggressively. "Why don't you want anyone else to know about us?" Kirishima's eyes were wide and vulnerable, and Katsuki's anger raged. "I told you, it's nobody's fucking goddamn business." His clenched fist on the table vibrated, with the effort it took for him to not smash it down again. Kirishima was quiet for a long time. When Katsuki finally lifted his eyes again, it looked like he was trying not to move, not to even breathe. A few terse seconds of incredible stillness passed between them, filled only with the sounds of Katsuki's heavy panting, which he was powerless to try and control. His body edged between fight and flight, swaying precariously with uncertainty and agitation between his two regrettable options. He didn't want to fight with Kirishima. It had been a foreign concept to him ever since he'd first met the redhead. Katsuki always wanted to fight. But Kirishima was so warm and inviting, so easygoing and accommodating, so careful and reckless at the same time, with the way he casually accepted Katsuki's bitter attitude, with a friendly smile and an amused laugh, with a strong arm thrown over his stiff, uninviting shoulder. Katsuki didn't want to fight with Kirishima, but he didn't want to run away from him either. It was an unsettling discovery, the day that he realized how little he wanted to be away from Kirishima. His absence grated on his nerves, and soured the air around him in a way he was still not entirely used to. Being with him was just better than not being with him, and Katsuki had never deprived himself of the things that he wanted most, and his body clawed desperately for him to make a fucking decision. Kirishima made it for him. "Get out, please." Katsuki's anger had never dissipated so quickly before in his life. "Huh?" He must have misheard him. He must have. Kirishima wasn't looking at him anymore. Apparently his math homework had suddenly become super fucking interesting. Katsuki didn't move, and after a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Kirishima finally looked back up at him. His expression was guarded, so unlike his bubbly, open personality, and the stark absence of warmth and fondness that Katsuki had grown so used to seeing left him cold. "I don't want you in here right now," Kirishima explained calmly, despite the quake in his voice, despite the obvious shine in his eyes. Katsuki glared at him. He didn't understand this feeling in his chest. The panic he'd suddenly been overcome with felt so out of place against the backdrop of Kirishima's bright room. He wanted to fight, but he didn't want to fight with Kirishima. He wanted to run, but he didn't want to run from Kirishima. He felt stuck to the floor. His limbs were heavy, like they'd never move again. Kirishima took a shaky breath, eyes sliding away from him. Please, just leave, Katsuki. Katsuki's eyes stung in an unfamiliar way. Fuck. Fucking shit. Fuck. He raised his fist and slammed it hard against the table again. Kirishima didn't even flinch, and he still didn't look up. Fine. If Kirishima wanted him to leave, then he would fucking leave. He snatched up his homework with hands that he decided internally were not shaking, stuffing the papers away into his bag, and shot to his feet. Kirishima hesitated before he stood up slowly as well, sliding his hands into the pockets of his cargo shorts, and pointedly looking at anything in the room that wasn't him. With his bag zipped, and his heart beating dangerously in his chest, Katsuki moved for the door. He stopped a few steps away from it, and turned unexpectedly, his shoulders heaving with every harsh breath he forced himself to keep taking. The anger in his stomach mixed uneasily with the feeling of dread that coursed through him when Kirishima lifted his head, just enough to look at him through his long eyelashes. They stared at each other. Kirishima's eyebrows pinched in the slightest, his jaw tight and unyielding. What? Katsuki almost let off an explosion. The fuck do you mean, what? He snapped, and he hated how put out his voice sounded even to his own ears. Kirishima looked uncomfortable and sad. I'm waiting for you to leave. Katsuki's hands curled dangerously at his sides, gripping tightly to the strap of his bag. And I'm waiting for... He stopped. This was so fucking ridiculous. Kirishima knew what he was waiting for. He knew what he wanted. Why the fuck was he being so difficult? Why was any of this ever even happening? You always fucking kiss me before I leave, he spat out, hating the way that the heat pulled into his cheeks. Hated how desperate he was. Kirishima's eyes were shiny again, as he dipped his head back down and stared at the floor. I don't want to, he whispered. He didn't want to. Katsuki's jaw clenched so tight, he wasn't sure if it was ever going to open again. Kirishima didn't want to kiss him. Was this it? Were they... over? It sure fucking felt like it. This didn't feel anywhere close to their usual spats, one that lasted for all of 20 minutes, before Katsuki demanded that Kirishima tell him what he must do to make everything better again. And then he would always fucking do it, no matter how bruised his pride felt, or how damaged his ego got, because fuck, Kirishima always fucking kissed him before he left. But now he didn't want to. And Katsuki didn't ask what he was supposed to be doing to make all of this okay, because he already fucking knew what that was. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he turned around, threw the door open hard enough that it slammed against the wall, and stalked out of the room without another word. Katsuki came to the regrettable conclusion that somehow, yes, they were over, when he arrived at lunch rush that afternoon for dinner, and saw his usual spot with the annoyingly self-titled Baku squad, taken over by Tetsu of all fucking people. He stared at the group of idiots for a long time, clenching tightly at his tray, and willing himself not to explode his food all over the place. Ashida was the first to notice him, her black eyes darting over, and spotting him a few meters away. She bit her lip and glanced at Tetsu, before she offered him a very pathetic shrug. Fucking bitch. She probably hadn't even tried to save his seat. Not that he fucking cared anyway. To hell with all these annoying morons. He snarled and stalked over to the closest table with a familiar face at it. He slammed his tray down next to Tokiyami, startling Jiro, who sat across from him, before he planted himself at his seat and started aggressively eating without a word. He felt the two of them share a look at his expense, which only made him spear at his noodles more angrily. You good, hotshot? Jiro sipped her tea with a cocked eyebrow. Shut the fuck up, Katsuki spat around his mouth full of noodles, as he chomped on them a bit harder than he needed to. Another shared look ensued, but neither of them prodded him further. He refused to let his gaze lift from his food. Fine. If Kirishima wanted them to be over, then they were over. No skin off Katsuki's back. The relationship had become a distraction anyway. Where he normally spent time studying, he'd found that he'd elected to instead lay next to Kirishima on his bed and watch movies while the other mindlessly rustled fingers through his hair. Where he normally spent time training at the gym or practicing honing his quirk, he found that he ended up going into town with Kirishima, spending hours at the arcade, and stopping at the diner down the street so that Kirishima could eat his beloved cheeseburgers. He slowly started replacing his work ethic with relaxation, and it was about time that came to an end anyway. Being second years at UA was already challenging enough, and no doubt third year would be even fiercer. He had to prepare himself, had to push himself more now than he ever had if he wanted to be number one. He'd suffered from worse setbacks before. This one would be no different. Still, he couldn't just ignore the tightening in his throat when his eyes casted over on their own to the sound of Kirishima's exuberant laugh. Tetsu was beaming proudly, like he'd just made the greatest joke in history, and the idiots around him chortled in amusement. Katsuki sneered as his chopstick snapped in two. Fucking disgusting. It became glaringly obvious that they were indeed over the next day in class, during hero training, when Kirishima had practically beelined it to stand next to Sir, and offered a partner with him. Katsuki didn't miss the bewildered expression on Sarah's face, as the tall fucker looked in his direction, clearly hesitant to accept the offer, when it became apparent routine to everyone for Katsuki and Kirishima to pair up, and disappear together somewhere in the back of the gym gamma. Usually they trained. Every now and again they didn't. It didn't fucking matter now. Sero accepted, and Kirishima clapped him on the shoulder with a beaming smile. Katsuki's insides burned. He stalked over to the other side of the room, and snagged Kaminari by the back of his shirt, ignoring the surprised squeak the other boy let out as he dragged him away. "You're my fucking partner today," he grumbled. And he hated how lackluster and void of threat his voice sounded. When had he grown so fucking soft? "Dude, I was already paired up with somebody," Kaminari whined, when he tripped over his own feet as he tried to keep up with him. "Tough shit," Katsuki barked back at him, refusing to acknowledge the other emotion that stabbed in his chest next to his anger. Bakugou Katsuki didn't get hurt. Especially not just because some redhead fucker didn't want to be his partner anymore. Who the fuck even cared anyway? Kaminari looked at him a little too long, in his opinion. "Are you okay? You seem..." He waved his hands around, as though the words would produce themselves. Katsuki glared at him, his jaw grinding in a way that made his dentist sigh, and tentatively schedule another appointment, far sooner than was usually necessary. "I'm fucking fine. Stop stalling, asshole." Kaminari winced, which would have been gratifying if Katsuki wasn't so fucking revved up right now. "Ouch. It's been a while since you've been this snappy," he mumbled under his breath. Katsuki's palms heated, and he let a few explosions seep out in quick succession to quell his growing agitation. Something else was quick on its heels, though. Something alien and unsettling. And he didn't like it. This feeling inside of his chest, inside of his throat. It felt too similar to the suffocation he'd felt from the sludge monster, from the warping villain, from everything. Maybe he'd been doomed to suffocate on one thing or another for the rest of his life. But Bakugou Katsuki was a fighter, and if he was going to be dragged down by anything, he'd fucking go kicking and screaming. He bent his knees and raised his hands, exploding a few more, bigger blasts. "Fucking fight me, you idiot!" Kaminari hesitated, which only made him angrier and more impatient. "Fine, I'll just fucking make you." He blasted off the ground and came soaring at him, hand propelled backwards with a deathly blow settled into his palm. Kaminari yelped, took a step back, eyes wide. He was vulnerable, out in the open. He didn't have a quirk suitable to stop something like one of Katsuki's more devastating hits. It was an unfair matchup. Even a hefty shock wouldn't be enough to deter the raging blonde from detonating if he wanted to. Kaminari wasn't the only one who figured all this out. Katsuki's palm exploded as he swung it forward, a raspy shout ripping from his throat, quickly muffled by a tremendous boom that tremored through the ground and dislodged several tall towers of boulders near them and came shattering down. Thick smoke obscured his vision as the aftershock spiraled up his arm and into his shoulder. He gritted his teeth against the sharp pain, ignoring it, before he swiped away a wall of offending fog. His resolve faltered at the sight in front of him. Kirishima's unbreakable form was something of nightmares when it was coupled with that of a disappointing glare and betrayal. He breathed heavily. The inner creaking of hard muscle turned to stone, sending a shiver down Katsuki's spine. He must have sprinted from the other side of the room at top speeds to be able to intercept such a spontaneous attack. Behind him, Kaminari sat on the ground, an arm raised in some weak form of defense, eyes wide and mouth slackened, a look of actual fear brimming in his eyes. It was directed at Katsuki, and it sent another irrational wave of anguish and helplessness through him. He snarled, dispelling it, forcing it away. He raised another hand, another explosion crackling in its build-up. Kirishima's teeth barred and clamped down, a low groan echoing in the air, as he raised his sturdy arms and crossed them, preparing for the blow. It came a second later, another loud crack and boom that sent tremors up Katsuki's legs as it reverberated through the ground. And then another, and another. He yelled and cursed and shouted with each one. His throat felt sore and scratchy from the smoke. His shoulders and back muscles spasmed with the effort it took to release detonations at such a close target, digging his heels into the floor and refusing to be forced back by the blows. Kirishima said nothing, did nothing to stop him, but took each hit with unmatched resolve, his eyes focused entirely on the blonde in front of him. It lasted a total of 5 long seconds before Kirishima's skin suddenly softened. Katsuki's hand flew forward and released nothing. Kirishima blinked at him, his arms still raised in that familiar crossed form, sweat coating his forearms and dripping off his elbows around the tattered remains of his uniform. Katsuki tried to catch a breath, tried to steady himself, but his lungs burned for air, and his arms shook where they'd fallen by his sides. Aizawa arrived beside them, eyes glowing and his scarf floating in that telltale way it did when he was using his quirk. He eyed the two boys who only had eyes for each other, before he let out a breath and finally blinked. The teacher pushed his hands into his pockets before he looked down at Kaminari. "Are you all right?" he asked tiredly. Kaminari blinked and closed his mouth. He slowly stood to his feet, casting a reproachful look at Katsuki, like he didn't really believe the fight was over, like he still didn't really feel safe. It sent another hot rod of anger shooting up Katsuki's spine. Kaminari opened his mouth. Words seemed to fail him, and he closed it again before he nodded. "All right then," Aizawa said. "Let's get back to it." "Thanks," Kaminari croaked out, eyes down as he bumped a hesitant shoulder into Kirishima's. The redhead didn't turn his eyes away from Katsuki. "No problem, man." Katsuki's hands curled into fists by his side. He ignored the feeling of panic that coursed through him again. He refused to acknowledge the desperation and the hurt. He clung to the anger. It was all he had left. Kirishima seemed fine, which meant that Katsuki was fine. He was. He was fine. The Baku squad didn't invite him to movie night on Wednesday, which was fine because he fucking hated movie night anyway. He always complained about being dragged out of his room, always hated the dumb movie they usually picked, always hated how easily everyone dogpiled onto Kirishima, like he was some stupidly attractive heated blanket, always hated how he refused himself the luxury of doing the same. Whatever. Movie night was the fucking worst, and he was fine to miss it for once. Still, the silence at his door as 8 o'clock came and went, the usual time that Kirishima would come to collect him, was palpable. He tried to read his textbook, tried to focus on the words in front of him, but something kept nagging at him. He was being so fucking obvious about all of this. He was fine, but he wasn't fucking acting fine. Kirishima was still laughing and eating with his friends. He was still sparring with Sarah with the same gun-ho attitude he always had when they sparred together. And he was still downstairs on movie night, probably being fucking cuddled to death. People were gonna start noticing Katsuki's piss-poor attitude. A few of them already had. They weren't fucking subtle with the way they whispered and averted their eyes. It made his insides recoil with something akin to shame or disgust. After 20 minutes went by of chewing on his cheek and staring at the same 4 sentences over and over again, Katsuki took a steadying breath and stood from his desk. It was time to start saving face. The thing he had with Kirishima was over, and that was fine, so it was time to start acting like it. If Kirishima could go on about his days as if nothing was wrong, as if it wasn't killing him from the inside the way it seemed to be doing with Katsuki, then he could do it too. His anger, which had become harder and harder to keep ablaze over the past few hours, transformed into competitiveness. He snagged his hoodie up from the end of his bed and forced it on over his tank top before he shuffled out of his room, trying to loosen the stiff muscles in his shoulders into something more casual. By the time he arrived down in the common area, his movements still felt a little too stiff, but he barreled forward as he did with everything else, until he came to an unsteadying stop by the edge of the couch. Kirishima sat in the middle of it, his arms slung over the back with his elbows pointed up towards the ceiling, caging his face away from Katsuki's sideways glance. Ashido was curled up beside him, her arm looped around his waist, and her head laying on his chest. Kaminari was on his other side, a leg thrown casually into his lap as they shared a bowl of popcorn lodged between their hips. Sarah sat on the other couch with Jura's feet in his lap, who leaned against Momo's shoulder while she texted on her phone. None of them acknowledged him. His eyes slid back to the television screen. It was a movie he vaguely recognized, though he couldn't recall where he'd ever seen it before. It was a quiet scene. A detective and his partner were sneaking through some kind of abandoned warehouse, speaking in hushed tones that amplified the sound of a hand plunging into the popcorn bowl. Something tapped Katsuki's hip, and he turned to glare it down on principle. Kaminari held a bowl of popcorn out to him, a reserved look on his face, like he expected Katsuki to explode it or try and kill him again. Katsuki sighed heavily. He hated how guilty he felt. He picked up a few pieces of popcorn off the top with a jerky nod and forced them into his dry mouth before he shoved his hand back into his pocket. Well, no one had told him to go away yet, so he supposed that was good. He stayed standing by the couch, refusing to lean against the armrest, refusing to let himself be comfortable, and watched as the detective and his partner burst into another room, with an aggressive kick to the door, brandishing guns and moving in sync. He felt awkward, like the others were just apprehensive of him standing there, and he forced the bubbling of resentment down his stomach. He tried to take his usual spot on the floor in front of the couch, as casually as he could, but he noticed how hard Kirishima jumped when he finally realized that he was there. He gritted his teeth and pulled his knees against his chest, wrapping his arms around them and clasping a hand around his wrist, giving himself something to squeeze. He tried to focus on the movie. He tried not to notice the tension in the air. And he tried not to hate himself when he realized that it was there because of him. Fuck. This fucking sucked. He should have stayed upstairs. There was a considerable amount of movement that happened behind him somewhere on the couch, and he chewed on the inside of his lip and glared at the television to avoid looking at it. Something light grazed at his back for just a second. A foot, maybe. He jerked at the unexpected contact, and turned his head just enough to see Kirishima's concentrated face, looking at him over his shoulder. He'd moved to sit on the edge of the couch, Kaminari's leg no longer on his lap, and Ashido now cuddling a pillow against the opposite armrest. Katsuki tried to ignore the pounding of his own heart in his ears. "You good?" Kirishima whispered, respectful not to disturb the movie for everyone else in the room. Katsuki still felt like they were all looking at him. He didn't know what he was supposed to say to that. What the fuck does that even mean? Kirishima must have noticed his confusion, because of course he fucking did, before he drummed his pointer fingers on either one of Katsuki's shoulders. "You've been working really hard the past few days. Feeling tense?" His voice was casual, but his eyes were full of concern. Katsuki's head was spinning, but he recognized what Kirishima was trying to do. Everything was fine between them, right? Nothing had happened as far as the others were concerned. Katsuki was just being extra volatile the past few days. Nothing out of the ordinary. He clenched his jaw and tried to glare before he turned back to the movie. "It's fine," he bit out. Kirishima hummed behind him, in a way he did when he knew Katsuki was lying. His warm hands enclosed around Katsuki's tight shoulders, thumbs kneading carefully into his shoulder blades. Kirishima didn't say anything more, as he worked at the exhausted muscle, and Katsuki didn't push him away. His chest and throat constricted in an unfamiliar way, and he forced himself back at the sudden urge to lean into Kirishima's space, to let his overwhelming warmth and kindness envelop him, to pretend for a while that nothing had really happened. He wanted to be oblivious, like he had been all those months ago, before he knew how he really felt about Kirishima. Before he knew how Kirishima really felt about him. Did Kirishima regret this? Katsuki couldn't help but think that he must. They should have just stayed friends. He shouldn't have ever opened his fucking mouth. Kirishima's fingers worked into him, burning somehow, through the thick layer of his hoodie that separated their skin from making contact. It had only been a few days, and Katsuki already missed his hands. The way they carded through his hair, the way they rubbed medicated lotion into his tender forearms, the way they traced designs into his bare shoulders, down his arms, across his back, the way they cradled his jaw during a passionate kiss in the dark of Kirishima's bedroom, the way they rubbed at sensitive skin that no one else had ever touched before, and where no one else would probably ever get close enough to touch again. It hurt when Kirishima's fingers stopped moving. Hurt more when he clasped a gentle hand onto his shoulder and squeezed in a reassuring way that felt more like a goodbye than anything else. Hurt the most when he moved back into the depths of the couch, instantly swallowed up by the needy limbs of his friends. Katsuki pressed his knees closer and tried to ignore the burning at the back of his eyes, and the way his chest rattled when he finally took in a deep breath, now that his sense weren't being bombarded by all things Kirishima. He was fine. He couldn't believe it had come to this. His cheeks blazed with shame and embarrassment. The air was hot and sticky in his room. The AC had gone out in their building sometime during the previous night, and the sweltering heat made Katsuki's dangerous sweat fall out of him in buckets. His fingers tightened on the pillow pressed against his bare chest, and he gritted his teeth, squeezing his eyes shut. Kirishima had acted in typical fucking Kirishima fashion. He'd strolled about the building in nothing but a pair of loose grey sweatshorts, his hair ungelled, pushed back from his sweaty forehead with his white bandana that Katsuki had grown so fond of seeing him in. It was ridiculous, the way he was so charismatically unaware of the way the muscles in his arms moved, as he stretched them high above his head, laughing at something Kaminari and Sarah were saying in the kitchen, his stomach contracting and tightening across hard muscle. Fucking ridiculous how oblivious he was to the way the sweat rolled down the sides of his neck, skating across sharp cheekbones, and racing down hardened pecs that, after Uraraka had squealed out in laughter, "They bounce when you flex," had led Kirishima to tighten and show off his true fucking Kirishima style. a bright, humorous smile flashing across sharp teeth, despite the familiar flush that rampaged across his cheeks when Uraraka scream-laughed at the display. Fucking shit, Katsuki grunted, repositioning, gripping the pillow closer as he rubbed against it. It had been 2 fucking weeks since his fight with Kirishima. 2 fucking weeks since he'd felt the touch of another's hands on him. Which was fine. He was fucking fine. He buried his face into the pillow, ignoring the sweat dripping down the back of his neck and the uncomfortable way the pillowcase stuck to his cheek and forehead. It was frustrating enough that the light friction wasn't doing anything to send him over the edge. Not even close. Frustrating more still that he couldn't get Kirishima's stupid fucking face out of his head. A gasp of air escaped him in a harsh breath, skidding through clenched teeth. The sound was so pathetic, Katsuki's explosive hands itched for destruction as soon as it registered in his ears. Fuck! He grabbed the pillow and threw it away from him towards the opposite wall, watching with growing agitation as it thumped softly before tumbling to the ground, nearly toppling over his desk lamp. He dug sticky fingers into his hair, pushing his bangs away from his forehead and pointedly ignoring the flush of heat in his cheeks. He'd scrambled for the glass of water on his nightstand, readjusting the pitiful excuse of a half-chub he'd been spouting for the past half hour, as he chugged the rest of the cool liquid. He debated tossing the glass at the wall too. Surely the resounding shatter would be enough to quench some of the burning flames licking at his stomach. But even he knew that would be fucking childish. He slammed the glass back down, before he let his head fall into his hands. He rubbed callous fingertips into his hairline, pressing roughly at his temple, and trying to force out the flashing images of late nights spent with Kirishima pressed close against him. They'd never been very good at any of that shit. Katsuki always got too impatient. His fingers always got slippery and dangerous. The condom sometimes fucking broke when he tore open the packaging with his teeth. They'd run out of lube a few times and had to fucking stop. But it always felt good. Kirishima had always kissed at his cheeks and jaw, had always rubbed strong hands into his back muscles, had always been careful and teasing and sexy. It had always felt right, even when it felt awkward. Even the first time, when neither of them knew what the fuck they were doing, and Katsuki had snapped in a moment of embarrassment, and Kirishima had cradled his face, and made everything okay again. It had always been perfect, because it had always been with Kirishima. The new had never felt terrifying. The unknown had never felt more like a challenge. Open and inviting, and exciting. Kirishima's fear of not being the best had never been quieter. He didn't need to be with Kirishima. He snarled at the floor between his feet, gripped at the spikes in his hair, let out another pathetic breath that sounded far too much like a choked sob. Fuck. He shot to his feet and rolled his shoulders, threw a random punch at the air, as though an invisible villain had invaded his privacy, before he stalked off to the bathroom to take his second cold shower in the past 3 hours. To the outside world looking in, Katsuki and Kirishima were fine. They had gravitated towards each other at some point, just like they always did. Katsuki had resumed sitting next to him at the table with the Baku squad. No one asked any questions about his 3-week-long absence. They made light conversation with each other that rubbed Katsuki the wrong way every time a private joke between them died, before it even made its way past Kirishima's lips. They got paired up for an English project that they purposely only worked on in the common area, or at Katsuki's desk during homeroom or study periods. Kirishima didn't lean on him much anymore, didn't nudge his side with a teasing finger, didn't ruffle his fingers through his hair when he got really worked up over something, didn't let his blazing eyes and beaming smile linger any longer than what was strictly necessary for friendly conversation. They continued to be partners during hero training, if only because Kirishima was worried about Katsuki trying to blow up any more of their friends. It was awkward. Katsuki purposely avoided any close-hand combat, purposefully refused anything more powerful than his AP shots, purposefully refused to acknowledge the fact that for the first time in his entire life, he was holding back, if the disappointed purse of his lips was anything to go by. But he didn't bring it up, and neither did Katsuki, and so to the rest of the outside world, they were fine. Bakugou Katsuki was not fine. He just fucking wasn't. He should have been by now, and that thought really fucking pissed him off. Good work out there, Kirishima-kun. Deku's voice filtered through the locker rooms, and instantly tightened the already sore muscles in Katsuki's back. Oh, thanks, Midoriya. I didn't realize anyone was watching me. Kirishima's sheepish laugh wrapped around Katsuki's neck, suffocating him. I couldn't help it. That new move is so cool. Do you mind if I pick your brain about it later? I'd love to know how you came up with it. Deku was practically begging. Katsuki snarled into his locker, resisting the urge to punch it, as he shoved his legs into his pants. Sure, maybe after dinner. You can come hang out in my room if you want. Kirishima sounded ecstatic, as he fucking should. His quirk was amazing. He was amazing. The fucking idiot just didn't know it. Wouldn't believe it. Sounds great. I can't wait. Katsuki slammed his locker closed, gripping his shirt in his hands. It wasn't a fucking date. It was just Deku being Deku, overstepping where he didn't fucking belong again. It still made Katsuki tense as he pulled on his shirt, and finally glanced over his shoulder as he worked the buttons. Deku was already halfway to the door, walking between Ida and Todoroki. Kaminari and Sero were whipping each other with towels in the corner, roaring with laughter and skirting away when the other got too close. Everyone else had already left. Kirishima stood in front of one of the mirrors on the wall by the showers, running fingers through his hair as he blow-dried it. He was still a little wet from the shower, a towel hanging precariously around his broad hips. Katsuki didn't need to be near him to know he was humming some dumb song under his breath. Eyes casted upwards to concentrate on the way his hair flopped between his fingers, with a little pout sticking his bottom lip out. Fuck. Katsuki missed that stupid lip. Hey, Kirishima, we'll save you a seat, Sarah called from where he held the door open. Clearly the two morons were tired of waiting. We might be done eating, though, by the time you're ready, Kaminari joked, and the two chuckled. Kirishima twirled around at the waist and beamed at them, hooking a thumb into the air. No worries, guys. I'll be done soon. Yeah. Sarah waved a dismissive hand, obviously not believing him. They walked out the door as Kirishima turned back to his mirror. In the quiet of the empty room, it was easy to hear his humming. Katsuki stared at him. It didn't go unnoticed by him that they were now alone for the first time in weeks. Really alone. He watched the way Kirishima's muscles moved along his shoulder blades and back as he shifted and shook the blow-dry around his head, kneading fingers through tangled locks, stubbornly refusing to use a comb. Kirishima looked relaxed. He looked fine, if it weren't for the subtle downward tilt of his lips, the little cloud in his usually bright eyes. Katsuki approached him with quiet steps, stopping a few feet away. Kirishima spotted him over his shoulder in the mirror. His humming ceased, and the movement of his fingers stuttered. They caught eyes for a second, and then Kirishima was pointedly looking away, resuming his task with a forced concentration that he couldn't even seem to muster up for his homework. Hi, Kirishima said, when it was obvious that he was not just gonna go away. Hey, Katsuki said. The silence persisted. Katsuki could tell he was making Kirishima uncomfortable, could see that the other was trying not to catch eyes with him again in the mirror. Finally, he turned off the hairdryer and set it down on the counter with a sigh. He turned up to look at him, and Katsuki let his eyes roam before he could stop himself. Down the hard lines of Kirishima's chest, along the vast expanse of muscle on his stomach, stopping at the offensive fabric that covered him further down. "What's up?" Kirishima asked, and his voice was decidedly casual, but the way he swallowed hard and tilted his head gave away more than he probably realized. He'd always liked being looked at. Katsuki shrugged, eyes flicking upward to meet the redhead's gaze. God, he fucking missed Kirishima. Missed him so much it hurt. Missed him so much despite still seeing him every day that he felt like he might go crazy if he didn't try, if he didn't persist, if he didn't chase. He's never held himself back from the things he wanted most. And right now, he wanted Kirishima more than anything. Wanted to talk to him again. To lean on him. To invade his personal space. To force him to laugh at his stupid fucking puns. He'd crumble all of his defenses to fucking pathetic dust if it meant that Kirishima would touch him again. Kiss him again. Hold him again. He stepped forward without meaning to. Noticed the jolt of some push-down emotion flash behind Kirishima's eyes. "Bakugou," Kirishima said. It sounded like a warning. Like a reminder. Katsuki froze. And then he didn't. He closed the distance between them stubbornly, ignoring the shift in Kirishima's stance, in the way his eyes shot to look at the door, then around the room, and then back onto him. He stopped in front of him, closer than he probably should have, closer than they'd been in weeks. Kirishima didn't move, because of course he wouldn't. He was an unwavering force, an unbreakable steed, the strongest person Kirishima's ever met in his life. The distance felt tantalizing, like it was mocking him, and he stared at Kirishima, not knowing what to do next. And Kirishima gazed back at him, secure and poised, and so fucking remarkable. "What's up?" Kirishima asked again, quieter this time. It must have been a reflex, an old habit of some kind. His eyes flickered down to Katsuki's lips, and back up again. It was too much. Katsuki closed the distance between them, clasping rough hands onto Kirishima's exposed biceps, and pressing into him. Kirishima stiffened in surprise, his own hands coming up to grab at his elbows. But he didn't move away, didn't throw him off. The closeness was too familiar, maybe. The touches were too natural to be anything dangerous, too comfortable to be anything sinister. Katsuki lowered his head onto his shoulder and breathed him in. Kirishima had always smelled the same, wrapped in some kind of pine tree foresty body spray that he used way too much of. Something sweet-scented clinging to his hair from all the product he used. Tangy cinnamon gum swirling around his mouth. Katsuki's hands gripped him tighter. Strong arms flexed under his touch, while soft fingers rubbed comforting circles along the bones of his elbows. "Are you okay?" Kirishima whispered against his hairline. His voice was soft and concerned, laced with some deep-seated love that he probably shouldn't still have. But Kirishima would always be filled to the brim with unconditional love. He'd always be warm and inviting, always positive and protective. He was beautiful and aimless and selfless and kind. All the things that Katsuki wasn't. He swallowed fine. Fine. Kirishima hummed. It was such a shit lie. He stiffened when he felt Kirishima's soft hands glide past his elbows, slowly moving to wrap around his slim waist, tugging him closer until there were no more spaces between them. His first reaction was to run. It was too nice, too comforting. He didn't deserve it. But Kirishima's hand on his back was soothing. The light brush of fingers, ghosting over sheer fabric, sent a shiver up his spine that made him feel so incredibly weak. He pressed into the warmth of Kirishima's body, nuzzled his face closer to his neck, and breathed in the musky scent of his skin. Kirishima shifted to accommodate for it. He didn't say a word when Katsuki's arms slipped around him, one clutching at his waist, the other hanging over his shoulder. Kirishima's heart was beating fast in his chest, and Katsuki tried to focus in on it, to store it away in his memory. Kirishima was warm. He was always warm, but his skin was heated from the shower he'd just taken, and from the hairdryer, and it lulled Katsuki's mind into a blank slate. His jaw unclenched, and his shoulders felt looser than they had in weeks. Kirishima sighed into his hair. "You're really tense lately," he whispered. Katsuki gripped at him tighter. He stopped. Definitely didn't fucking choke. He tried to take a breath, inhaled Kirishima's body spray until he was dizzy. The words were on his lips, right on the tip of his tongue, and he wanted to just fucking spit them out, but he'd never been good at saying anything worthwhile. He always got caught up in the ridiculousness of it. Always felt too embarrassed, too open and raw. He'd never been great with words. He turned his head and buried deeper into Kirishima's neck, pressing his lips against the base of his throat over the thrumming of his scattered pulse. Kirishima's fingers, which had lazily begun to scratch a pattern onto his lower back, suddenly froze, and his breath hitched. Katsuki lowered his chin away, and then lifted it again, to press his lips more firmly against his neck. Kirishima's fingers gripped at the back of his shirt. Katsuki. Maybe it was meant to deter him, the use of his given name. Some sort of desperate attempt. But it didn't. It really fucking didn't. It did the exact fucking opposite. He kissed at his neck again, tightening his arm around Kirishima's waist to pull him even closer, if it were possible. Kirishima's breath stuttered, hitched, before he leaned further into him. Katsuki's thoughts turned to distant white noise. He brought his hand up to grip at the back of Kirishima's neck, fingertips diving into soft, freshly washed tufts of hair that slipped around like silk. He kissed at the base of his throat, then again on the side of his neck, moving upward at a slow, leisurely, all-consuming pace, trying desperately to file away the taste of his skin, the feel of his chest shuddering out little puffs of excited breath. He pressed into him, trapping him against the counter, and sliding a thigh into the taut front of his towel. Kirishima opened his mouth as though he was going to say something. Probably something about how they were at school, how they were broken up, how they shouldn't be doing this. Katsuki didn't want to fucking hear it. He pulled his head away and crashed his lips down onto his mouth to smother the words before they could even take root. Kirishima whimpered into him, sighing heavily through his nose and warming his cheek, before his strong hands closed around him more purposely and pulled him closer. It was easy for Katsuki to feel his erection through the towel as he pressed his thigh further between his legs. Easier still for him to slide his hands across the damp map of his muscles, touching at places he knew would make him sigh before he even did it, caressing at skin that made goosebumps jump across his arms. He dug his fingers into Kirishima's hair, gave it a tug, and groaned into his mouth with satisfaction when Kirishima rubbed it against his thigh in response. His skin burned under his uniform as he rolled his hips, desperately searching for the familiar friction he'd grown to receive from Kirishima's sturdy form. He broke his lips away to catch his breath, opening his eyes to memorize the look on Kirishima's face. His eyes were closed, and his cheeks were pink. His kiss-swollen lips parted, just enough to reveal the tempting tips of sharp teeth. Katsuki rolled against him again, pressed a hand into his lower back to guide their erections together. Kirishima bit his lip, eyes still closed, to keep from making the sound Katsuki had been so hoping that he would have made. "Look at me," Katsuki said. His voice sounded raspy and low. Kirishima's eyes opened, and Katsuki habitually leaned his forehead against his. He lifted a hand to touch at Kirishima's jaw, to graze back along to his ear, to cup at his cheek, and feel the heat that radiated off of it against his palm as they moved against each other. "Miss you," he forced out through his tight throat. Kirishima's eyes were shiny again, brimming with tears. He gnawed on his lip, gripped harder at Katsuki's hips, and pressed more urgently against him. A door opened somewhere. Katsuki froze, and Kirishima's watery eyes widened in panic. "Kirishima, are you still in here?" Kaminari called out, like nails on a chalkboard. Katsuki leapt away, quickly putting distance between them. His heart pounded so hard against his ribcage that it actually hurt. But it was nothing compared to the disappointed look that flashed across Kirishima's face. Nothing at all compared to the lone tear that slipped down his cheek. Kaminari was coming closer. The sound of his footsteps echoed across the room. "Kirishima!" Kirishima grabbed at his clothes, bunching them up in front of his crotch, before he sighed loudly and caught Katsuki's eyes again. He didn't say anything else, before he pushed away from the counter and started in the direction of Kaminari's voice. "Over here, dude. Sorry, I didn't hear ya." Katsuki watched him go, not really knowing what to say or how to feel. The only thing he could focus on were the facts, and the fact remained that Kirishima had kissed him back. Hadn't forced him away, hadn't rejected him at all. It gave him something that felt too much like hope. Katsuki clung to it. It happened like this. Kirishima would not leave him alone about spending the holidays together before the end of their first year at UA. It had made him anxious at the time. Nobody has ever wanted to spend the holidays with him, especially not on Christmas. That was specifically reserved for couples and romance. Did Kirishima not know that? Was he really so oblivious? It seemed like something he would know. Katsuki had always pegged him as some kind of mushy romantic love enthusiast, so he must have known the implications of spending the winter holidays together. He must have. But when he recommended that they go camping together, had even suggested that Katsuki teach him the basics of mountain climbing, there hadn't really been much of a reason for him to say no. His parents would be working well past when he moved back in from school, and there really wouldn't be anyone at home to distract him or entertain him. And Kirishima would just not let it go. Every day for the whole week leading up to winter break, despite all of the stress hanging around in the air for their upcoming finals, Kirishima would persist in the most Kirishima way possible. "Any plans for the holidays, Kirishima-kun?" Uraraka asked sweetly. It was late, and Katsuki was making dinner in the kitchen. He could practically hear the beaming smile on Kirishima's face, without ever turning around to look at him. "Yeah, I'm going camping with Bakugou." And then in a stage whisper, as though Katsuki couldn't fucking hear him, "He just doesn't know it yet." From the way Uraraka had giggled, Katsuki knew that Kirishima had winked. It wasn't that Katsuki didn't want to go camping with Kirishima. It wasn't even the problem that Kirishima wanted to go during the winter holidays. Katsuki had never bothered to empathize much with the romantic attachments of Christmas. It just wasn't something he ever paid attention to before. The problem was the fact that he couldn't stop paying attention to it now. What was the big deal, even? It's not like anyone from their class would suspect anything like that if they knew about it. Not when it was in the direct reference to Katsuki. No one would even bat an eye to know that he and Kirishima had spent the romantic holiday, huddled together in the same tent several nights in a row. Which is exactly what made it so fucking weird. No one would even think twice about it. Uraraku had merely laughed when Kirishima had announced his grand plans. Kaminari had merely sulked about the fact that he was going to be out of town. Sarah had merely nodded and told him it sounded like it would be a good time. Ashido had merely smiled and chirped out a stupidly happy sentiment of, "Send me pictures!" No one had even questioned it. No one had even mocked it. No one had joked or teased in any sort of way that was usual for them. It was like they all expected it. Like it wasn't weird that it was Kirishima and Katsuki at all. When did he let Kirishima get so close? It had made his palms sweat in a way that had nothing to do with fighting. It had made his heart beat in an exaggerated way that made him worry that he was finally going to have a heart attack like his doctor kept insisting he would if he didn't learn to chill the fuck out. But how could he possibly chill the fuck out when his best friend wanted to spend so much of his free time around him? Nobody wanted to spend their free time with Katsuki. But Kirishima did. Kirishima insisted on it. "Don't you want to hang out with your family or some shit?" Katsuki grumbled angrily. There were only 2 days left of school. Their exams had already come and gone, and Kirishima was still making plans like it was already a surefire thing, asking what clothes he should bring and what clothes he should have. Kirishima shrugged, popping another hard candy into his mouth. The movie they had been watching played on the screen of his laptop, forgotten. "I'll still see them over the break. It's not like we'll be gone for the whole 3 weeks." "Why do you want it so fucking bad?" Katsuki hadn't been able to keep from asking. His cheeks felt warm, and he refused to look at the redhead, even when he laughed good-naturedly at the question. "I don't know. I want to hang out with you. Plus, I think it'd be really fun, don't you?" Katsuki snorted. "It'd be a fucking nightmare." Kirishima hummed in that all-too-familiar way, the smile on his face softening. Somehow, somewhere over the next few days, Katsuki had caved. He couldn't get it out of his head. It would be fun, he had realized in some sort of shock horror late at night in his bed. Kirishima always made it fun, no matter what they were doing, no matter what terrible mood Katsuki had resigned himself to being in that day. Kirishima always appeared, like some annoyingly vibrant beacon, all broad smiles and dumbass jokes, and waggling eyebrows that made Kirishima snort at how fucking ridiculous he was. Kirishima knew how to handle him, even when he was at his worst. He knew how to prod at Katsuki's competitive side, just enough to get him invested. Knew how to crowd into his space, and calm him down when he was on the edge of exploding. Knew how to draw out the deep-bellied laughs from inside of him that he thought had all but gone extinct sometime at the start of middle school. He was loud and solid and warm and happy. Kirishima was always happy to be around him. Katsuki had noticed it. When he walked into a room and caught Kirishima's eye, the redhead would grin at him, like he was genuinely excited to see Katsuki's grumpy fucking face. Who the fuck even did that? It was in that moment, standing dumbfounded in the doorway of their classroom, on the last day of their first year, that Katsuki had made that all-too-startling discovery. That if he didn't go camping with Kirishima, he probably wouldn't see that idiot's dumbass smile for 3 whole fucking weeks. And somehow, that was more upsetting than the uncomfortable notion of spending some stupid romantic holiday together. So Katsuki had caved. They left on a Thursday morning, clad in winter gear and thick hiking boots, with bulging backpacks and sleeping bags, and a rolled-up tent strapped to Kirishima's wide back. And it had been fun, just like Kirishima had said it would be. Katsuki relaxed for the first time in months, finally away from the bustling of the city, finally away from their annoying classmates, finally alone, even if it was just with Kirishima. And if Kirishima noticed any changes in his behavior, he didn't say anything about it. He just continued to laugh and talk and joke as if it had been the greatest day of his life. It had all started to unravel the very first night. They'd covered a lot of ground on that first day. Katsuki had refused to stop for lunch, shoving a protein bar into Kirishima's chest and grumbling at him to keep moving. Kirishima hadn't complained, just munched happily on the protein bar and kept asking questions that Katsuki found himself answering without much thought to it. He'd expected to be exhausted when he finally crawled into his sleeping bag, expected to have fallen asleep easily, like he always did when he was out in the mountains. But Kirishima had been so close, had radiated such warmth in such a small space, that Katsuki's brain couldn't think of anything else, couldn't push past the fuzzy barriers of how good Kirishima smelled, how intoxicating his smile was, how his hand was hanging outside of his sleeping bag, lying innocently in the space between them, like he wasn't afraid to be near him, like he wanted to be near him. Katsuki spent that whole first night staring at the place where he knew Kirishima's hand to be. He wondered what it felt like, not to hold it since he'd kind of already done that, but just to touch it, to trace fingers along the pronounced veins on the back of his hand, to press the pad of his thumb against the soft underside of his wrist, to feel his heartbeat through it. Katsuki had stared all night, and Kirishima hadn't moved a muscle in his sleep, despite being the world's worst tosser. Like he knew Katsuki was watching, like he didn't dare disturb him. The next day was torturous. Katsuki's sleep-deprived mind could only focus on Kirishima, on the way his bright red hair reflected off the blinding backdrop of snow, the way his nose tinted pink against the wind, the way he smiled and reached cold fingers out to pinch at Katsuki's cheeks when he was being grumpy. He couldn't focus on anything else. He was incredibly on edge, which was the only reason his foot had slipped on that icy surface of that rock. The only reason he hadn't realized he was falling backwards, falling off the mountain's edge, until suddenly he wasn't anymore. A strong hand grabbed at and caught hold of his wrist, wide red eyes gazing down at him. He should have snapped. He usually would have, annoyed and embarrassed at making such a rookie mistake. But he hadn't. Kirishima's hand was soft. His grip was firm and warm around Katsuki's wrist. He hadn't let go immediately when they rappelled back down to the snowy ground below. Katsuki hadn't shaken him off either. It made his head spin every time he thought about how much he let Kirishima get away with, how often he let the other boy lean on him, how casually he allowed Kirishima's fingers to ruffle the top of his hair, how easily he forced down his inexperience with all this kind of shit, if it just meant that Kirishima would keep getting into his space. The bulk of it happened on night 2. Katsuki couldn't stop himself. He reached out with slow, searching fingers, until he grabbed Kirishima's hand in the dark. Kirishima, already asleep and snoring, had jerked awake at the contact. Katsuki had been grateful that it had been too dark to see his face. He was sure his own was blazing red. But Kirishima had relaxed almost immediately, fingers gripping back like Katsuki's hands weren't dangerous weapons, ready to explode at a moment's notice. Like he trusted Katsuki not to hurt him, trusted that Katsuki didn't want to hurt him. Kirishima had run his thumb along the back of his hand, sending shivers up his arm and down into his spine. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had held his hand like that. The rustling of his sleeping bag told him that Kirishima had turned to face him, despite not being able to see any of it happen. Breathing evenly, As if unaffected by all of it, Kirishima had invaded his space once again, and Katsuki had let him. Kirishima had brought their connected hands up off the ground, brushing light, soft lips at the juncture of Katsuki's wrist. His heart had leapt into his throat. His face felt hot with embarrassment. But the new had never been terrifying with Kirishima. It had just felt right. "Kirishima," he whispered, and it never felt real, even in the moment. Kirishima hummed against his skin, finger rubbing comfortingly. "Are you gonna fucking kiss me or not?" Kirishima had laughed, Katsuki's wrist still pressed against his lips, the sharp grazing of teeth on his flesh as he smiled. Katsuki barely had time to register the skip in his pulse when Kirishima had tugged him forward, crashed their bodies together through their sleeping bags with a confidence, for once, Katsuki did not feel. He missed his mouth at first. It was dark, even though they were right in front of each other, and his lips had brushed across his nose, down to the corner of his mouth, setting him on fire, before finally slotting onto his own like they belonged there. It had been uncoordinated and messy. Katsuki hadn't really known what the fuck he was doing, which had made him feel self-conscious and angry, and like he wanted to retreat on himself. But Kirishima hadn't let him, would never let him run away from a challenge. His fingers had trailed a blazing path onto the back of his neck, other hand still grasping desperately as his. Katsuki would have thought that the next morning would have been awkward. And it had been, a little bit, in the beginning at least. But after Kirishima had accidentally dropped a good portion of their morning coffee into the snow, and Katsuki had yelled and grumbled angrily about it, and Kirishima had laughed at him in a way he did because he had never been afraid of Katsuki or his temper, things had felt just a little bit too normal to freak out over. Too comfortable to even worry about it. The third night, they hadn't even gotten into their sleeping bags before Kirishima kissed him again. Katsuki hadn't even bothered to pretend that he hadn't been hoping he would. He could hear them next door now, chattering away. Despite having asked to pick at Kirishima's brain, it seemed like Deku was doing most of the fucking talking. Katsuki refused to acknowledge how much he was straining to try and hear what they were saying. It didn't matter anyway. Their voices were muffled beyond recognition. All he knew was that they were laughing and talking and joking. It made him fucking sick. He raised a fist and pounded angrily on the wall, sneering at it as though it had done something horribly offensive, which it had. The voices on the other side of the wall stopped. Deku muttered something incomprehensible. Kirishima answered with a huffed laugh, probably something dismissive, probably excusing Katsuki's behavior, probably smiling sheepishly with a hand on the back of his neck. Katsuki banged on the wall again, 4 times, just for good fucking measure. He nearly jumped out of his bed when Kirishima knocked back. 3 times, one right after the other. Katsuki stared at the wall, mouth hanging open a little. He didn't know how to interpret that. People didn't generally knock back when someone banged on their wall to get them to shut the fuck up. But of course Kirishima would. Of course he fucking would. Katsuki banged on the wall again, glaring through the sting in his eyes. On the other side of the wall, Kirishima laughed at his antics. He knocked back again, 3 times, steady and confident, just like the first 3. Katsuki didn't bang again. There was no point to it. Kirishima would just keep knocking back. A fucking idiot. He huffed and turned back to his textbook, trying desperately to ignore the muffled voices that started up once more, though they were significantly quieter this time. There wasn't any more laughter. Katsuki tried not to feel shitty about it. After another hour of insufferable murmuring, Deku finally got up and left, closing Kirishima's door calmly, before hurrying past Katsuki's room, with quick steps as though he expected the blonde to leap out and attack him, which wasn't too far off from what Katsuki wanted to do. But he didn't, of course. He'd matured quite a lot, if anyone had fucking noticed. The silence from Kirishima's room rang in his ears. He didn't realize how intently he'd been listening into it until he heard the 3 sharp knocks on his wall again. He stiffened to prevent himself from jumping, before he turned to glare suspiciously at it. He hadn't talked to Kirishima since their exchange in the locker room. Hadn't even seen him at dinner since Katsuki had decided to go back to the dorms and make himself some food, before slinking off to spend the rest of the night in his room, not sulking. He could still feel the hard presses of Kirishima's body against his, could still feel the wetness of his mouth, and taste the tingling leftover of his gum on his tongue. He shifted uncertainly, before he raised a fist and knocked back, quieter this time. 3 sharp taps. He knew somehow that somewhere on the other side of the wall, Kirishima was probably smiling. It wasn't that Katsuki was ashamed of Kirishima. He assumed that's what the other boy thought. Assumed that's why Kirishima was so upset about the fact that Katsuki didn't want anyone to know. Assumed that's why his parents, being oblivious to him and Kirishima's rapidly developing relationship, had rubbed him the wrong way enough to finally speak up about it. Kirishima was self-conscious like that. He was insecure. He didn't know how amazing he was. Katsuki hadn't really known either when they'd first met. He hadn't exactly come to UA with the intent of meeting what very well could be the love of his fucking life within the first few months of his first semester. It hadn't even crossed his mind. Kirishima was just loud. He was vibrant. He demanded attention wherever he went. He was just there, all the fucking time. At USJ, at the sports festival, at summer camp, at Kamino. He had always been there, materializing before Katsuki's very eyes, as if out of thin air, and refusing to leave his side no matter how many times he insulted his shitty hair or his shitty clothes, or whatever else Katsuki focused on, in an attempt to not focus on his face, to not become familiar with it. That had all gone to shit when he started to think about reds in terms of the shades and tones of Kirishima's hair. Started to recognize his horrible fashion sense as something endearing, and so wholeheartedly Kirishima, that he couldn't even sneer at it anymore. The first time Katsuki's eyes had found Kirishima's face, had spotted it from afar as though he'd never seen it up close before. They were at the arcade. Kirishima had convinced him to go one day, after he'd gotten done rehearsing for the school's festival concert. Another thing Kirishima was amazing at that he didn't even realize. He could convince Katsuki to do pretty much anything. Kirishima had run off to the ticket counter to inquire about a dirt bike that definitely cost more money in tickets than it did to just buy it at the store. Katsuki had been left by the pinball machine, aggressively smacking buttons and pulling levers, aiming for the high score with a vengeance. He'd been so focused, so intent on winning, that Kirishima's laugh from the other side of the room had actually startled him enough to make him jump. It was just 1 second, his eyes flicking away from the machine, and in that 1 second, the pinball soared past his defenses, and the game flashed and declared his defeat with mocking lights and a high-pitched jingle. Katsuki almost didn't realize that he'd even lost. Kirishima was standing by the ticket counter, laughing at something the old man was saying behind the counter, eyes crinkling at the corners, and mouth turned upwards in a megawatt smile that very well could have blinded everyone around him. The old man muttered something, looking uncertain as his wrinkly eyes darted over to Kirishima, and Kirishima turned to point at him, beaming with something that resembled pride. Their eyes met across the room. Kirishima's smile stretched wider, if it was even possible, and he waved like the fucking idiot he was. And the only thing bouncing around in Katsuki's dumbass brain was, this motherfucker is really fucking pretty. The pieces started to fall in place shortly after that. Kirishima became ever-present, building and growing and morphing every day. Katsuki stored little bits and pieces of information away, the same way he did when he was studying for an important exam. Kirishima was strong. Kirishima was funny. Kirishima was loud and determined and kind and uplifting. Kirishima was amazing. It had stabbed at his pride the first time the thought had entered his mind. Compared to Kirishima, what even was Katsuki? It was nothing. Katsuki demanded attention in the room in the same way that he pitched a fit and clawed his way to get it. Kirishima demanded attention from the room with his smile, with his laugh, with his everything. He didn't even need to fucking do anything, and people were clamoring to talk to him, desperate to reach him. Where they avoided Katsuki like the plague, where they averted their eyes and whispered behind their hands and made every conceivable effort to avoid touching him at all costs. They practically fell over themselves to be near Kirishima, to bask in the warmth of his gentle eyes and reassuring hands, to be the person he focused on, even if it was just for a rush minute before the start of class. Kirishima was a magnet. Kirishima was the sun. He was the embodiment of purity and love and everything a hero should be. Anyone would be proud to have him. Anyone in their right mind would want the opportunity to show him off, to proclaim to the world that he was theirs, to demand that everyone know that this magnificent man had chosen them. Katsuki wanted people to know too. He'd always wanted people to know. He'd wanted every excuse to tug Kirishima away from the crowds that followed him, to keep him selfishly for himself, to glare at anyone who dared to think that they could ever take him away. But he knew how people thought of him, knew the image he had created for him. He wasn't fucking stupid. He wanted it that way. It was who he was, brash and rude and condescending. He didn't want them to see him differently. Didn't want anything to change. Didn't want people to stop being afraid of him. That didn't mean the comments didn't sting all the time. Why is Kirishima always hanging out with that boy? He's so rude. Kirishima is so sweet. I can't imagine yelling at him like that. What is that guy's problem? How can he be so rude around someone like Kirishima? Kirishima deserves better. His parents would be the first one to admit it. He knew that for a fact. He'd seen it in his mother's eyes when Kirishima had appeared on their front step, ready for their camping trip, all bright-eyed at 7 in the morning, with floppy red hair that clashed horribly with his neon yellow jacket. His mother had made some kind of offhand remark, something about Katsuki not deserving such a nice friend. And yeah, he already fucking knew that, but it didn't fucking hurt any less. It didn't make the recognition, and the reality, any easier to deal with. He'd selfishly clung to Kirishima over the 6 months of their relationship. He kept him away from his friends in order to spend more time with him. Had refused to help any of the other idiots study because he hadn't wanted them interrupting their alone time. Had bristled angrily whenever Kirishima had suggested they just tell him the truth. Katsuki couldn't handle the truth, and for all he knew, Kirishima couldn't either. The idiot just didn't know it, and Katsuki didn't know how to tell him. Didn't know how to convey it in a way that Kirishima would understand, and realize why nobody could know. Why Katsuki could never tell anyone. But he knew he had to try. Because if he saw Tetsu and Kirishima bump their fucking hips together one more goddamn time, he was going to lose his fucking mind. He stood from his spot on the ground before he had time to register what he was doing. His body moved on autopilot, avoiding stepping on his classmates, who all laid out in the grass under the sun, like a bunch of stretched-out cats. Kirishima's laugh led him further up the hill, where he and a few others were kicking around a football. Kirishima had removed his shirt, because of course he had, and his skin glistened with sweat that stuck his bangs to his forehead, as he tried to steal the ball away from some guy Katsuki didn't know by name. He stopped somewhere along the sidelines, sweaty hands curled into fists, and waited to be noticed. It took another few minutes of Kirishima laughing and shoving and dribbling the ball before his red eyes finally landed on him. He stopped playing almost immediately, barefoot rolling on the ball, before he passed it away to someone else with a shout of, "I'll be right back." Katsuki's breath hitched as Kirishima jogged over. He stopped in front of him, chest heaving, as he placed his hands on his broad hips, and grinned tentatively, like he couldn't really believe that he was standing right in front of him. "I need to talk to you." Katsuki rushed out, before Kirishima could say anything and distract him. Kirishima leveled him with a steady gaze, eyes darting around his face as he nibbled on his lip, still breathing heavily. He wiped his arm along his forehead, collecting sweat, before he nodded, a nervous energy buzzing around him. "Okay, sure." Katsuki waited awkwardly for something to happen, before he ground his teeth together. "Not here." Kirishima blinked at him before he sighed. "Where?" Katsuki tore his gaze away and scanned the hill. The whole class was out there. 2A was a mix of students from their original class and from Class 1B, and they all enjoyed their unexpected day off, with a collection of comfortable conversations and board games spread out across blankets. He spotted a tree on the other side of the hill, far enough away to be considered private, and he jerked his chin over to it. Kirishima followed his gaze before he nodded again, and reached down to pick up his shirt, which he didn't put on, much to Katsuki's annoyance and simultaneous relief, but merely hung around his neck. He turned on his heels and started for the tree with Kirishima beside him. Neither of them spoke, ignoring the happy chatter and the warm rays of sun that surrounded them. It wasn't uncomfortable. Kirishima knew when to be quiet, despite popular belief, and their silences had always been nice. But the air was charged with notable tension and hesitation. Katsuki ignored it, of course. He ignored it all the way until they got to the tree. He sat down on the ground and pressed his back against the trunk, pointedly avoiding looking at Kirishima. His hands were so sweaty that he had to wipe them on his shorts, and he hadn't even fucking said anything yet. Kirishima knelt down beside him, balancing on the balls of his feet, like he didn't expect to say long. Ouch. "Would you fucking sit the fuck down?" Katsuki snapped, unable to keep the nervous tremor from shaking his voice. He winced and pulled his knees tighter to his chest. Kirishima blinked in surprise before he fell down on his butt like a toddler, letting his knees bounce as his hands fell between his legs to tug anxiously at the blades of grass. "What's up?" Katsuki stared at him. He watched a single drop of sweat race down the side of his face, until it dripped off his jaw, examined the little scar of his eyebrow, and resisted the urge to reach out and touch it. He clenched his hands into fists in his lap. "Bakugou." Kirishima's head tilted to the side. Katsuki glared, his anger spiking dangerously. "Don't call me that." Kirishima looked even more surprised. "I don't—" He trailed off, biting his lip. "I want you to call me Katsuki." Kirishima sighed and rubbed at his forehead. "What do you want to talk about?" he said instead. Oh, fuck. This was it. He scratched angrily at his cheek. He didn't know why this talking bullshit was so hard for him, but he couldn't take this anymore. He had to know if there was still a chance of fixing this. He had to know what was going on in Kirishima's head. "I want to get back together," he forced out. He stared daggers into his kneecaps, willing the blush he felt creeping up his neck to go away. Kirishima sucked in a breath beside him. "I know." Katsuki actually startled at that. He whipped around to look at him, and his heart nearly leapt into his throat when he saw the little smile tugging at the corner of Kirishima's mouth. And it was directed at him. "What the fuck?" He winced as soon as the words were out, but Kirishima only chuckled and shook his head. I got the message pretty clear in the locker room." Kirishima stared at the blades of grass between his fingers, with the same intensity that Katsuki had been staring at his knees. Why the fuck haven't we then? Katsuki cleared his throat when Kirishima's eyes flashed up to look at him through the bangs of his hair. He tried for a calmer tone. Why haven't you said anything to me? Kirishima looked like he was choosing his next words carefully. He took a breath, his broad shoulders heaving with effort, before he said, "Because I don't want to be someone's secret, Katsuki." When he didn't get a response, he continued with a sigh. "It's one thing not to tell anyone because you haven't come out yet. I thought that's what it was at first, which is why I didn't really push anything. I didn't want to make you do anything that you aren't comfortable with." Kirishima bit his lip. "But to not tell people about us just for the sake of not telling them is... It's nobody's fucking business," Katsuki said. His throat felt tight again. Kirishima looked at him sadly, and the shoulders seemed to drop impossibly low. "Yeah, you said that. It's not because of you." Kirishima's eyebrows pinched together as he pursed his lips. "What does that mean?" Katsuki looked away from him. His whole body felt like it was vibrating. It was screaming at him to run away, begging him not to do this, not to reveal something that would most definitely solidify their breakup. It hurt too much. He didn't want to break up. But Kirishima deserved to know the truth, so... "It's me." Kirishima still looked confused. "What is you?" Katsuki shifted on the hard ground and tried to ignore the sting in his eyes and the heat in his face. He opened his mouth to say something, and his first word cracked embarrassingly. He clenched his eyes shut and ground his teeth together, fucking hating himself already. "Katsuki." Kirishima slid across the dirt to scoot over and sit next to him. Their shoulders pressed together, and Kirishima immediately leaned into him. He was so solid and warm and familiar. He wanted to touch more, but he held himself back. "What's wrong?" Katsuki took a shaky breath before he opened his eyes again. He forced himself to look at Kirishima in the eyes, so it would be harder for him to argue when he eventually said, "You're too fucking good for me." Kirishima blinked at him. And then he blinked again, like his brain wasn't processing the words. "What?" he finally asked. His face crumpled into a look of bewilderment and anger. "Who the fuck told you that?" Katsuki looked away again, over at the mass of their classmates several meters away. He let his clenched hands dangle from the tops of his knees. "No one had to fucking tell me, idiot. It's obvious." "It's not obvious to me." Kirishima almost sounded offended. "Yeah, because all you ever do is see the fucking good in people." Katsuki ground his teeth together. "But everyone else can fucking see it. They know you're too good for me. They don't even fucking understand why you're friends with me. How the fuck do you expect them to react when they find out we're..." He choked again, before he glared at nothing and forced the words out anyway. "That we were dating." "Who is they?" "Huh?" Katsuki turned to look at him. The sweat on Kirishima's face had dried, and there was a sweat of dirt along his jaw, and his hair was a fucking mess. It almost hurt to look at him, to see up close how beautiful he was. "You keep saying they. Who is they? Give me a name." Kirishima's nostrils flared dangerously. He looked like he was getting ready to fight. The thought made Katsuki snort and roll his eyes. "What are you gonna fucking do? Track him down?" "Fucking maybe," Kirishima bit out. Katsuki stared at him, and it made his chest tighten with something warm when he realized how honest Kirishima was being right now. He looked like he was getting ready to punch somebody, ready to storm up to somebody right here and now and crack them in the nose and risk getting expelled. My fucking mother, for one thing. Katsuki pushed out between gritted teeth. Kirishima blinked, his anger lingering, even as his bottom lip jutted out in a furious pout. Well, shit, I can't really fight her. The thought of Kirishima storming up to his parents' house demanding a fight was a little too much. Katsuki tried to push his smile down. He didn't feel like he should be smiling right now, but he must have been doing a horrible job at hiding it, because Kirishima's face softened almost immediately. He lifted a hand up and brushed a curled finger gently across his cheek. You're so pretty, Kirishima whispered. Katsuki knew his face was bright red, as he shoved Kirishima's shoulder as hard as he could. The other boy barely moved, just teetering away for a second, before coming back to rest against him. Shut the fuck up, Katsuki grumbled, rubbing a rough hand over his burning face, before he glared up at the sky. You're the fucking pretty one. Dude, come on, I'm manly as hell. If anything, I'm rugged. Kirishima wiggled his eyebrows, and bit his lip in a way that Katsuki decided was far too cute to acknowledge, so he didn't. He huffed a laugh and rolled his eyes, but the dread was already building inside of him again, despite the pleasant atmosphere that Kirishima brought with him everywhere he went. Katsuki would have to sour it again. Forever a rain cloud on a perfectly sunny day. I can't tell anybody. The silence that followed was suffocating. Katsuki. Kirishima pressed harder into him, leaning forward to try and catch eyes with him. Nobody thinks you're not good enough for me. Katsuki sneered. Yes, they do. Why do you care what they think? You never cared before. I don't care what they think. They could think I'm the worst person to ever fucking walked on this goddamn planet if they wanted to. Then what's the problem? The problem is... Katsuki's breath caught in his throat. He shut it out a gasp and looked at the sky again, to push back the stinging in his eyes, gripping his knees desperately to hold himself together. The problem is you deserve better. Someone fucking happy and social and shit like you are. Kirishima laughed. The sound was so unexpected that Katsuki's chest instantly loosened, before he stiffened again, on principle. Are you saying you're not a happy social person? Katsuki blinked at him like the true fucking moron that he was. Are you fucking saying that I am? Kirishima laughed again, harder this time, waving a hand around as though he needed a minute to collect himself. Okay, well, yeah, I mean you're not like the normal image of a happy social person, but you still are. When Katsuki only stared at him in bewilderment, Kirishima smiled fondly. I've seen you happy, Katsuki. I like to think that sometimes I've got something to do with it. And I've seen you social. At the school festival and, movie nights. I fucking hate movie nights, Katsuki grumbled, for lack of anything else to say. Kirishima's fond smile only grew softer. His red eyes were warm and enchanting, and Katsuki wanted nothing more than to lean closer. No, you don't. Otherwise you wouldn't still go to them. You never leave me the fuck alone when I don't, Katsuki argued, indignant. Kirishima hummed in that special fucking way, lips pursed together as though fighting back an amused smirk. I mean, I haven't been coming to get you the past few weeks. Katsuki's brain faltered at that. Kirishima's lips turned up a little more. Yet you always end up down there. Katsuki shifted uncomfortably. His butt was starting to feel numb, but he ignored it in favor of drinking in the details of Kirishima's face. It had been so long since they'd had a conversation at this length, even longer since they'd sat so close together. I fucking missed you and shit, he grumbled, jaw clenching. Kirishima's smile turned somber. I miss you too, you know. Katsuki's throat clenched for the billionth fucking time. He looked away and poked his tongue into his cheek. Don't fucking lie to me. Kirishima huffed an exasperated laugh. I've never once lied to you. He never had. Katsuki knew for a fact that Kirishima was honest to a fault. Something about being manly and living life to the fullest with no regrets or some shit. Katsuki. He couldn't ever ignore Kirishima when he sounded like that. All breathless, like the very word took all the air out of his lungs. He looked back at him after a moment of trying not to. I want to get back together too. Kirishima's heart could have stopped beating right then and there, if it wasn't immediately kick-started a second later. But I can't do that if you won't at least try. He wanted to try. He found himself needing to in that very moment. He wanted to be everything Kirishima needed. Wanted to be good enough. Wanted to be able to kiss him again. To have long nights spent in his room again. To go on more camping trips that ended with both of them squeezed together in one sleeping bag. Kirishima wanted it too. Wanted him to try. Wanted to be open with their affection for the whole world to see. For everyone to pick it apart. What if he realized they were right later down the road? Would it be worth it to cling on to this before it inevitably turned sour? Before Kirishima realized that he deserved better? That he deserved the world so much more than Katsuki could ever possibly give him? His silence must have been some kind of answer that he wasn't even aware he was giving. Kirishima sighed and rested a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it tightly. Katsuki's skin under his tank top burned at the contact, before he hoisted himself to his feet. I guess just think about it then, Kirishima mumbled, pushing a hand through his hair as he gnawed on his lip, before he turned away and started back across the lawn towards the rest of their classmates. Katsuki watched him go, just like he had in the locker room. Watched as the sun made his hair glow brighter. Watched as his back muscles moved with every step, as the light gleamed against his rapidly tanning skin. Watched as someone called out Kirishima's name. Watched as Kirishima raised an arm and waved back at them. Watched as he got further away. Fuck this shit. Katsuki shot to his feet. He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing in his chest, as he watched the Baku squad turn on their blanket a few meters away, eagerly calling Kirishima over to them. His feet moved before he knew what he was doing, just like they had back in the locker room. He picked up his pace as the distance between them grew shorter. He was painfully aware of Ashido's curious gaze on him, aware of the way Kaminari seemed to tense as he rose to his knees, aware of the way Sarah grabbed his elbow to keep him down, eyeing Katsuki with a guarded expression. Something in the back of his mind was telling him not to do this. That he was being selfish. That Kirishima really did deserve better than him. But he didn't care to listen to it. Not anymore. Not right now. Knowing Kirishima was walking away from him for the second fucking time. He couldn't watch it happen again. Ejiro! Kirishima jumped at the sound of his voice. He turned on his heels, mouth parted in surprise, and his eyebrows shot up to his hairline as he watched Katsuki approach with quick steps. It made his heart hammer harder in his chest when he recognized a little flash of hope that crossed the other boy's face. What? You want everyone to know? Fucking fine. Katsuki didn't slow down. Didn't think he could, until he was practically colliding into him. His hands reached out and grabbed the shirt still hanging around Kirishima's neck and yanked him forward. He only had a second to see Kirishima's bright eyes ablaze with excitement. Only had a second to watch his lips quirk upwards in a tentative, disbelieving smile. Only had a second to worry that he might actually throw up with how fast his heart was racing in his chest, before he slotted their mouths together defiantly. He rode the waves of competitiveness, rode the waves of anger, rode the waves of uncertainty and longing that collided and sloshed around in his chest for all they were worth. Adrenaline coursed through his veins. His head felt dizzy under the beating heat of the sun. He tasted sweat on Kirishima's mouth as he tongued along his bottom lip, grabbing tight to the damp shirt around his neck like a lifeline. Kirishima responded immediately, with no hesitation and no reserve. He wrapped his strong arms around Katsuki's waist and forced him closer, opening his mouth and darting his tongue out to swipe back along Katsuki's own. Someone whistled in the distance. Katsuki could barely hear them. Woo! Get some Baku, bro! Kaminari shouted. That Katsuki heard. He let go of Kirishima's shirt and lifted a hand over his shoulder to raise his middle finger in the direction that he assumed the voice had come from. Kirishima's lips pulled into a smile against his mouth as his arms tightened on Kirishima's waist. Call me that again, he whispered, words dripping with affection. Don't you ever fucking leave me again, Ejiro. Kirishima's smile grew even wider. Never, Katsuki.